Hi, I'm Elena. My sister once told me I was too damaged to handle real responsibility after I came back from deployment. Then I overheard her on the phone, planning my murder for our father's inheritance. They thought a veteran with PTSD would be the perfect, tragic suicide. But what they didn't count on was me faking my death first and recording every single moment of their celebration. Before we dive in, tell me, have you ever discovered that the people closest to you saw you as nothing more than an obstacle to remove? Drop a comment below. I read every single one. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. I was sitting in my father's study going through his medical bills when the notification buzzed on my phone. Another reminder about his oncologist appointment, another insurance claim denial, another night I'd spend calculating how many more treatments we could afford before his savings ran dry. Dad had been fighting stage 3 pancreatic cancer for 8 months, and the medical expenses were bleeding us dry faster than his body was giving up. The house felt different since his diagnosis. Quieter, more fragile, like we were all walking on glass, afraid that speaking too loudly might shatter whatever time we had left. I'd moved back in 6 months ago, officially to help with his care, but really because I couldn't stand the thought of him facing this alone. My apartment in Denver sat empty while I played nurse, accountant, and daughter to a man who was disappearing a little more each day. My military training had taught me to compartmentalize, to focus on the mission at hand, but watching your father waste away isn't a mission you can strategize your way through. Every morning I'd wake up at 0500, out of habit, check his vitals, sort his medications, and pretend that routine could somehow hold back the inevitable. The structure helped. It always had, ever since I'd gotten back from Afghanistan 3 years ago with more baggage than I'd packed. That's when I heard voices drifting up from the kitchen below. My sister Vivian's laugh, sharp and bright, followed by a man's voice I didn't recognize. I glanced at the clock, 2:47 p.m. She wasn't supposed to be here today. Hell, she was rarely here any day unless Dad specifically asked for her, and even then she'd show up late with some excuse about traffic or work or whatever crisis was currently consuming her social media management business. I closed the laptop quietly and moved toward the hallway. The old house had thin walls, something I'd forgotten during my years in military housing, where privacy meant closing a door that actually blocked sound. Here, conversations carried like whispers in a cathedral, and right now I was grateful for the architectural flaw. The timing has to be perfect, Vivian was saying, her voice lower than usual but still carrying that commanding tone she'd perfected in the college debate team. Dad's condition gives us maybe 2 months, 3 at most, but we can't wait that long. Why not? The male voice was careful, measured, professional. If he's as sick as you say, because she's here now. The way she said she made my skin crawl. There was only one person Vivian referred to with that particular brand of disdain. Elena's been playing nursemaid, making herself indispensable. Dad's getting sentimental about her sacrifice, talking about adjusting the will to reflect her contribution. My hand found the wall, steadying myself as the room seemed to tilt slightly. They were talking about me, about Dad's will, about timing that couldn't wait for his natural death. The PTSD angle is perfect, Vivian continued, and I could hear the smile in her voice. Everyone knows veterans have the highest suicide rates. She's been struggling since she got back, barely holding it together. Dad's death could easily push her over the edge. Tragic but not unexpected. The man murmured something I couldn't catch, but Vivian's response was crystal clear. Pills would be cleanest. She already has prescriptions for anxiety and sleep issues. An accidental overdose during a grief spiral. Who would question it? I pressed my back against the wall, my training kicking in automatically. Breathe. Assess. Plan. But this wasn't a combat zone. This was my childhood home, and the enemy was my own sister discussing my murder like she was planning a dinner party. What about the house? The man asked. It's a $2 million property in Cherry Hills Village, plus Dad's portfolio. The life insurance, his collection. We're looking at close to $4 million total. Vivian's voice had taken on that business-like tone she used when discussing clients. Elena inherits half under the current will, but if she's gone, everything comes to me as the surviving child. $4 million. That's what my life was worth to her. That's what our father's lifetime of work meant to the daughter who'd visited him exactly 3 times since his diagnosis. I heard chairs scraping against the kitchen floor, footsteps moving toward the front of the house. They were leaving. I waited until I heard the front door close, and Vivian's BMW start in the driveway before I moved from my position against the wall. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from rage so pure it felt like electricity in my veins. Walking back into Dad's study, I stared at the family photo on his desk. Vivian and me at 16 and 18, arms around each other at her high school graduation. We looked happy. Close. I remembered that day, how proud I'd been of my little sister, how I'd promised to always look out for her. Apparently, she'd been counting on that promise to make me an easy target. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. Jake Morrison, my old squad leader, now working private security in Colorado Springs. If anyone could help me disappear and reappear at will, it was him. The phone rang twice before his familiar, gravelly voice answered. "Ramirez, what's the situation?" "I need a favor, Sarge, a big one. Can you meet me tonight?" "Sounds serious. You in trouble?" I looked around my father's study, at the medical bills scattered across his desk, at the photo of a family that no longer existed, at the room where I'd spent countless hours trying to save a man who was dying while my sister planned to kill his other daughter. "Not yet," I said, "but I'm about to be." That evening, I drove to Jake's apartment in Colorado Springs, taking the long route through the mountains to make sure I wasn't followed. Old habits. In Afghanistan, paranoia kept you alive. Apparently, it was a useful skill in civilian life, too. Jake lived in a converted warehouse in the Arts District, the kind of place that looked sketchy from the outside but was actually a fortress of surveillance equipment and tactical gear inside. He'd started his security company after leaving the Army, specializing in executive protection and corporate espionage. His client list included politicians, celebrities, and businessmen who had made enough enemies to need professional paranoia. He was waiting for me with coffee and the kind of focused attention that meant he knew this wasn't a social call. Jake had always been able to read a room, read a situation, read the micro-expressions that revealed when someone was operating under extreme stress. It's what made him a good leader in combat and an excellent security contractor in civilian life. "Talk to me," he said, settling into his chair with the patience of someone who'd heard plenty of complicated stories. I told him everything. Vivian's phone conversation, the inheritance, the plan to make my death look like suicide. I spoke with the clinical detachment I'd learned in debriefings, laying out facts without emotion, letting the information speak for itself. When I finished, Jake was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. Finally, he leaned forward. "You want to fake your death?" "I want to catch her in the act," I corrected. "I want evidence. I want her to hang herself with her own rope." "Dangerous game, Elena. If she's serious about killing you." "She's serious. You didn't hear her voice." I met his eyes. "This isn't some fantasy she's entertaining. She's got a plan, she's got help, and she's got a timeline. The only question is whether I let her execute it or whether I execute mine first." Jake nodded slowly. He understood the military mindset. When facing an enemy, you had 2 choices: wait for them to strike or take control of the engagement. "What do you need from me?" The plan Jake and I developed over the next 3 days was elegant in its simplicity. Military operations succeed because they rely on clear objectives, precise timing, and contingency planning. Faking my death would require all 3, plus something the Army had never taught me: the ability to watch my own family celebrate my demise without breaking cover. I spent those 3 days establishing my new normal, a routine that would make my eventual disappearance seem both tragic and inevitable. Every morning, I made sure the neighbors saw me checking the mail, looking increasingly haggard and withdrawn. I stopped showering regularly, wore the same clothes for days, and let my usual military precision slip into something that looked like depression spiraling out of control. The performance wasn't entirely acting. Knowing that Vivian was planning my murder while I changed our father's bedpan and organized his medications created a kind of psychological pressure I'd never experienced, even in combat zones. In Afghanistan, the enemy was clearly defined. Here, the enemy shared my DNA and had spent Christmas mornings opening presents beside me for 26 years. Dad noticed the change, of course. "Elena, sweetheart, you look exhausted," he said on Tuesday morning as I helped him with his breakfast. His voice was weaker than it had been even a week ago, but his eyes were still sharp, still worried about everyone else despite his own condition. "I'm fine, Dad. Just tired." I forced a smile while crushing his morning pills into applesauce. "The nursing rotation is wearing me down a bit." He reached out with a trembling hand and covered mine. "You don't have to carry this alone, you know. Vivian could help more if you asked her." The irony was so bitter I almost laughed. Instead, I squeezed his hand gently. "Vivian has her own life to worry about. Besides, this is where I want to be." That much was true. Despite everything, despite the inheritance plotting and the murder planning and the casual way my sister discussed ending my life, I wanted to be here with him. These might be our last weeks together, and I wasn't going to let Vivian's sociopathy rob me of that time. On Wednesday afternoon, I drove to a medical supplies store in Aurora, paying cash for the items Jake had specified. Theatrical blood that would show up convincingly in photos. A small device that could simulate the absence of a pulse when placed correctly against a wrist. Makeup designed for special effects, the kind used in movies to create believable corpses. The clerk, a thin man with elaborate tattoos covering both arms, didn't ask questions. He'd probably seen stranger purchases. But as he rang up my items, he looked at me with the kind of recognition that made my stomach tighten. "You're military," he said, not a question. "Was?" "Marines? Army? 3 tours." He nodded, understanding passing between us without explanation. "These supplies," he said, gesturing to my purchases, "they're for something important. Very important." He bagged everything carefully, double-checking that the theatrical blood was properly sealed. "Good luck, soldier." Walking back to my car, I realized how many people could see through whatever facade I thought I was maintaining. If this clerk could identify me as military just from my posture and purchasing decisions, Vivian would definitely notice if I wasn't careful about selling my deteriorating mental state. That evening, I implemented the next phase of the plan. I called Vivian, making sure my voice carried just the right amount of exhaustion and emotional instability. "Hey Viv, I know it's late, but I needed to talk to someone." "Elena? What's wrong? You sound terrible." "I don't know how much more of this I can handle." I let my voice crack slightly. "Dad's getting worse, and I feel like I'm drowning. The medical bills, the insurance fights, watching him fade away piece by piece." "Oh, honey." Her concern sounded so genuine that for a moment I almost believed she actually cared. "You've been carrying too much. Maybe you should take a break, let hospice take over for a few days." I can't abandon him now. But Elena, I'm having thoughts. Dark thoughts. About what happens when he's gone. About whether I can handle being alone again. I paused, letting the silence stretch. Sometimes I think about just ending it all, follow him into whatever comes next. The silence on her end lasted too long. When she finally spoke, there was something new in her voice. Something that sounded almost like excitement, carefully disguised as concern. "Elena, you can't talk like that. You need help, professional help." "I know, I've been thinking about increasing my medication dosage. The anxiety is getting unbearable, and the sleeping pills aren't working anymore. Maybe if I just took a few extra." "No!" Her response was too quick, too sharp. She caught herself immediately. "I mean, you need to talk to your doctor first. Don't self-medicate, please. Promise me." "I promise," I lied. "Thanks for listening, Viv. I love you." "I love you too, Elena, more than you know." After I hung up, I sat in Dad's kitchen staring at my phone. More than you know. $4 million worth of love, apparently. The next morning, Jake arrived at the house driving a white panel van with Colorado Mountain Medical Transport painted on the sides. He'd borrowed it from a client who owned a legitimate ambulance service, complete with proper licensing and documentation that would stand up to casual inspection. We spent an hour rehearsing the logistics. The timing had to be perfect. I needed to die when Vivian wasn't at the house but could be reached quickly enough to arrive while my body was still warm. Too long and the temperature difference would be noticeable. Too soon and she might be present for details that could expose the deception. "Remember," Jake said as we ran through the sequence for the third time, "shallow breathing, pupils fixed and dilated, no pulse point that isn't blocked by the device. The theatrical blood goes under your nose and in your mouth, but don't swallow any of it. The stuff is non-toxic, but it tastes like hell. How long do I have to maintain it? Depends on how thorough the EMTs are and whether Vivian insists on riding to the hospital. Worst case scenario, 20 minutes. Best case, 5. 20 minutes of playing dead while my sister potentially celebrated over my corpse. I'd endured longer psychological torture during CRA training. But this felt different. More personal. More likely to leave permanent scars. Friday morning, I called in sick to the home health aid service that had been supplementing my care for Dad. Then I sent Vivian a text, "Having a really bad day. Don't come by, I need space to think." She responded within minutes, "Of course. Take care of yourself. Call if you need anything." At 2:15 p.m., I positioned myself in Dad's bathroom with the supplies Jake had provided. The theatrical blood was cold against my skin, but it photographed convincingly in the mirror. The pulse-blocking device felt foreign against my wrist, but it worked. When I checked with my other hand, I couldn't detect a heartbeat. At 2:23 p.m., I called 911 from my cell phone, making sure to sound increasingly slurred and panicked. 911, what's your emergency? I think I took too many pills. I can't think straight. Something's wrong. Ma'am, what's your location? I gave them Dad's address, then let the phone drop as if I'd lost consciousness. The 911 operator's voice continued calling through the speaker, but I didn't respond. According to the timeline Jake and I had established, I had approximately 12 minutes before the EMTs arrived. I positioned myself on the bathroom floor, scattering empty pill bottles around my body and making sure the theatrical blood was visible but not obviously fake. Then I triggered the emergency alert system on my medical bracelet, the one that would automatically contact Vivian as my emergency contact. At 2:31 p.m., my phone buzzed with an incoming call. Vivian's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring. At 2:34 p.m., sirens approached the house. The game had begun. The EMTs burst through the front door with professional urgency, their heavy boots echoing through the hallway as they followed the sound of the still active 911 call. I heard them calling out, Ma'am, can you hear us?" as they searched the house systematically. My body lay motionless on the cold bathroom tiles, the pulse-blocking device Jake had given me, creating the perfect illusion of death. "In here!" one of them shouted when they found me. I felt hands checking my wrist, fingers pressing against my neck where the device would mask any sign of life. The theatrical blood had pooled convincingly around my mouth and nose, and I'd positioned the empty prescription bottles just close enough to suggest an intentional overdose without making it look staged. "No pulse," the first EMT announced. His voice was calm, professional, detached in the way that medical personnel learned to be when dealing with death. "Looks like an overdose. Multiple prescription bottles. Xanax, Ambien, oxycodone." "How long?" his partner asked, and I felt hands lifting my eyelids, checking my pupils with a small flashlight. "Hard to say. The body's still warm, but rigor hasn't set in. Could be anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours. Through barely cracked eyelids, I watched them work. They were thorough but not suspicious. Everything about the scene suggested exactly what Vivian had described on that phone call. A depressed veteran who couldn't handle her father's terminal illness and had decided to end her own suffering. "We need to notify next of kin," one of them said, reaching for the emergency contact information on my medical bracelet. "Elena Ramirez, emergency contact Vivian Ramirez Chen." I heard one of them step into the hallway to make the call. His voice carried clearly through the thin walls. "Ms. Ramirez Chen, this is Colorado Mountain Medical. I'm calling about your sister Elena. I'm afraid I have some very bad news." There was a pause then. "Yes, ma'am, we found her unresponsive in her home. It appears to be an overdose. I'm very sorry for your loss." Another pause, longer this time. I strained to imagine Vivian's face, the expression she was wearing as she received the news she'd been hoping for. "We're at 4737 Cherry Hills Drive. The scene is secure, but you may want to come identify the body before we transport to the coroner's office." When the EMT returned to the bathroom, his partner was already beginning to clean up their equipment. "Sister's on her way," he reported. "Should be here in about 20 minutes. She sounded pretty shaken up." 20 minutes. I had to maintain the charade for 20 more minutes, lying motionless on the bathroom floor while they waited for Vivian to arrive. My military training had taught me to control my breathing, to remain perfectly still even under extreme stress, but this was different. This was personal in a way that combat never was. The EMTs moved me onto a gurney with practiced efficiency, covering my body with a white sheet that they pulled up to my chin. The theatrical blood had dried slightly, creating what I hoped was a convincing enough death mask to fool my sister's casual inspection. "Poor kid," one of them murmured, as they wheeled me into the living room. "You can see she was military from the way she kept her space. Everything is organized, disciplined, probably made it harder for her to ask for help." "PTSD's a killer," his partner agreed. "These vets come home and nobody knows how to help them readjust. Family thinks they should just snap out of it, get on with their lives." If only they knew how right they were about my family's attitude toward my service and its aftermath. I heard a car door slam outside, followed by the rapid click of heels on the front walkway. Vivian had arrived, and she was moving fast. The front door opened without a knock. She still had her key from childhood. "Where is she?" Vivian's voice carried a perfect blend of grief and shock. If I hadn't overheard her planning my murder, I would have believed she was genuinely devastated. "In the living room, ma'am. I should warn you, it's not an easy sight." Vivian's footsteps approached the gurney where I lay beneath the white sheet. I felt her presence beside me, the familiar scent of her expensive perfume mixed with something else. Excitement, maybe, or relief, barely contained beneath a facade of sisterly anguish. "Can I see her face?" she asked, her voice breaking in exactly the right places. "Of course, take your time." The EMT pulled back the sheet, exposing my head and shoulders. I felt Vivian's eyes on me, studying my face for any sign of life. The pulse-blocking device was working perfectly. Even I couldn't detect my own heartbeat through the interference it created. "Oh God, Elena," Vivian whispered, and I felt her hand touch my cheek. Her fingers were cold, trembling just enough to seem authentic. "I should have known. I should have seen the signs." "You couldn't have prevented this, ma'am," one of the EMTs said gently. "Depression and PTSD are diseases. Sometimes people hide how much they're struggling." "She called me yesterday," Vivian continued, her voice getting stronger as she warmed up to her performance. "She said she was having dark thoughts, but I never imagined. I told her to see her doctor about her medication. I should have come over, should have stayed with her." The guilt in her voice was masterful. If there were Academy Awards for pretending to mourn a sister you just murdered, Vivian would win unanimously. "Was she caring for your father?" the EMT asked, clearly trying to understand what might have triggered my supposed suicide. "Yes, Dad has pancreatic cancer. Elena moved in 6 months ago to help with his care. She'd been struggling since she got back from Afghanistan and watching Dad deteriorate. I think it just became too much for her." "Where is your father now?" "Hospice facility," Vivian lied smoothly. "We moved him there last week when Elena started having trouble managing his care alone. She felt like she was failing him." I wanted to open my eyes, to sit up and confront her lies, but I forced myself to remain motionless. Dad was upstairs in his bedroom, probably wondering why there were sirens and voices in his house. The hospice story was Vivian's way of explaining why he wouldn't be asking questions, or contradicting her version of events. "We'll need you to formally identify the body for our report," the EMT said. "Can you confirm this is Elena Marie Ramirez, your sister?" "Yes," Vivian said, her voice steady now. "This is Elena. This is my sister." The way she said it sent chills through my supposedly dead body. There was something final about her tone, something that suggested she'd been waiting to speak those words in the past tense for a very long time. "We're very sorry for your loss, Ms. Ramirez-Chen. Do you have any questions about what happens next? What about arrangements? The funeral? The body will be transported to the county coroner's office for an autopsy, which is standard procedure for unattended deaths. After that, you can work with a funeral home to make arrangements. The coroner's office will release the body to you once they've completed their examination." Vivian nodded, already thinking ahead to the logistics of disposing of my body permanently. I wondered if she'd opt for cremation to eliminate any possibility of future evidence, or if she'd choose burial to maintain the appearance of a grieving sister. "Is there anything else you need from the scene?" she asked. "We'll need to secure the house and notify the appropriate authorities. Since this appears to be a suicide, there may be some additional paperwork, but nothing that should delay the release of the body." "Thank you. You've been very kind." As they prepared to wheel me out to the waiting ambulance, I heard Vivian's phone buzz. She answered it immediately, stepping away from the gurney but not far enough to be out of earshot. "Yes, it's done," she said quietly. "No, completely natural. The EMTs said it was textbook suicide, depression, PTSD, terminal family member. No one will question it." There was a pause as she listened to whoever was on the other end. "Tonight," she continued, "I'll start making calls about the funeral arrangements, and we can begin the probate process next week. Everything should be finalized within 90 days. 90 days. She was already planning to cash in on my death before my body was even cold. The ambulance ride to the coroner's office felt like the longest 23 minutes of my life. I lay perfectly still on the stretcher while Jake, disguised as the second EMT, monitored my vital signs with equipment he'd modified to show flatlined readings. The real EMT sat up front with the driver, occasionally glancing back but showing no suspicion about the readings on Jake's doctored machines. Every bump in the road sent vibrations through my supposedly lifeless body, and I had to concentrate on remaining completely limp, despite the natural instinct to brace against the movement. The theatrical blood had begun to congeal around my mouth, creating an uncomfortable pulling sensation on my skin, but I couldn't risk even the smallest movement to adjust my position. Jake had briefed me on this part of the plan extensively. Once we reached the coroner's office, he would create a distraction that would allow me to slip away during the transfer process. The timing had to be perfect. Too early, and the real EMT would notice my disappearance. Too late, and I'd end up actually on an autopsy table with very little chance of maintaining the deception. Through the small window in the ambulance doors, I could see the Denver skyline growing larger as we approached the city center. The coroner's office was located in an older building downtown, surrounded by municipal parking lots and government offices that would be mostly empty on a Friday afternoon. Jake had chosen the location specifically for its lack of foot traffic and security cameras. "ETA 3 minutes, the driver called back to us. Jake squeezed my hand once, so briefly that the real EMT wouldn't have noticed. It was our signal that the extraction was about to begin. I felt him adjusting something on the monitoring equipment, probably setting up whatever technical malfunction he planned to use as cover for my disappearance. The ambulance pulled into the loading bay behind the coroner's office, with a slight jolt that I absorbed without flinching. Outside, I could hear the driver talking to someone, probably a coroner's assistant or security guard, about the incoming body. "Standard Friday afternoon suicide," he was explaining. "Veteran, PTSD, found by EMTs after a family member called it in." The rear doors opened, and cool afternoon air washed over my face. I kept my eyes closed and my breathing imperceptible as hands began to release the gurney's securing mechanisms. This was the most dangerous part of the entire operation, the moment when multiple people would be handling my body, and any mistake could expose the deception. "Careful with the IV line," Jake said to the coroner's assistant. "We had some equipment malfunctions during transport, so the monitoring might be glitchy." As if on cue, one of his machines began emitting a high-pitched alarm. "Damn it," he muttered, apparently struggling with the device. "This unit's been acting up all week. Can someone give me a hand with this?" The real EMT moved to help him, and I felt the attention shift away from my body for a few crucial seconds. In that moment, Jake's other hand found the pulse-blocking device on my wrist and removed it with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd performed similar extractions in far more dangerous circumstances. Suddenly, I could feel my own heartbeat again, strong and rapid with adrenaline. But I kept my breathing shallow, and my body completely relaxed as they finished transferring me from the ambulance gurney to the coroner's wheeled stretcher. "We'll take it from here," the coroner's assistant said. He was a thin man in his 50s, with tired eyes and the kind of professional detachment that came from handling death every day. "Any personal effects?" "Just what she was wearing when we found her," Jake replied. "Sister's handling the rest of the arrangements." I felt myself being wheeled through a doorway into what must have been the coroner's office. The air was noticeably cooler inside, with the antiseptic smell of medical facilities mixed with something else. Formaldehyde, maybe, or industrial cleaning chemicals. The wheels of the stretcher squeaked slightly as we moved down what sounded like a long corridor. "Storage bay 4, someone said, and I heard the electronic beep of a card reader followed by the hydraulic hiss of a heavy door opening. This was it. Once they put me in cold storage, I'd have to break cover or risk hypothermia. Jake had assured me he'd create another distraction before that happened, but as I felt the stretcher begin to move toward what I assumed was a refrigerated storage unit, I started to worry that something had gone wrong with the plan. Then I heard Jake's voice, closer than it should have been if he was still dealing with equipment in the ambulance. "Excuse me, I think we left something in your facility yesterday. Different case, but my partner was asking about a personal item that might have been overlooked during intake." "What kind of item?" the coroner's assistant asked, and I could hear him stopping the movement of my stretcher. "Military dog tags. The family's pretty insistent about getting them back for the funeral. Would it be possible to check your personal effects log?" "I suppose we could take a look. What was the name of the case?" "Rodriguez, I think, or maybe Martinez." My partner wasn't entirely clear, and you know how these family situations can get emotional. The assistant sighed with the patience of someone who dealt with bureaucratic requests all day. "Let me see what I can find. Can you wheel her into Bay 4? "I'll be right back." I heard footsteps moving away down the corridor, followed by the sound of file cabinets opening in a distant office. Jake wheeled me into what felt like a smaller enclosed space, probably the storage bay where they kept bodies awaiting autopsy or release to funeral homes. "Clear," he whispered, and I immediately opened my eyes and sat up on the stretcher. The room was exactly what I'd expected: sterile white walls, multiple refrigerated storage units, and the pervasive smell of death masked by industrial disinfectant. Jake was already moving toward a service door marked "Emergency Exit" that he'd obviously scouted in advance. "We've got maybe 3 minutes before he comes back," Jake said, helping me off the stretcher. "Can you walk?" My legs were stiff from maintaining the death pose for over an hour, but I managed to stand without wobbling. "I'm good. What about the monitoring equipment?" "Already handled. The malfunction will show that you flatlined during transport, which explains why there's no body in storage. By the time they figure out what happened, we'll be long gone." We moved quickly toward the emergency exit, Jake disabling what appeared to be a simple alarm system with a device he'd brought for that purpose. The door opened onto a narrow alley behind the building, where a different vehicle, a dark blue sedan with civilian plates, was waiting with the engine running. As we drove away from the coroner's office, I finally allowed myself to breathe normally for the first time in over an hour. The theatrical blood was starting to itch, and I could taste the chemical aftertaste it had left in my mouth. But we'd successfully completed the most dangerous part of the operation. "Phase 1 complete," Jake said, handing me a bottle of water and some wet wipes to clean my face. "How do you feel about being officially dead?" "Liberated," I said, and realized I meant it. For the first time since overhearing Vivian's murder plot, I felt like I had the upper hand. What's next? Now we wait and watch. Vivian thinks she's won, which means she'll start making mistakes. People always get careless when they think they're safe. Jake had rented a furnished apartment in Lakewood under a false name, complete with surveillance equipment and a clear view of the house where my father was still living alone, probably wondering where everyone had disappeared to. The plan was for me to monitor Vivian's activities while maintaining my deceased status long enough to gather evidence of her true motivations and methods. "What about Dad?" I asked as we pulled into the apartment complex's parking garage. "He's gonna wonder what happened to me." "Vivian will tell him you're dead," Jake said matter-of-factly. Probably tonight, after she's had time to work out her story. The question is whether she'll stick with the suicide narrative or create something that makes her look more sympathetic. The apartment Jake had prepared was sparse but functional, basic furniture, multiple computer monitors, and enough surveillance equipment to run a small intelligence operation. He'd already set up cameras with views of my father's house from 3 different angles, along with audio monitoring capabilities that could pick up conversations in several rooms. "This is impressive," I said, examining the setup. "How did you manage all this in 3 days?" "I told you, my client list includes some paranoid people. When you're protecting someone who thinks the government might be monitoring their communications, you learn to set up secure facilities pretty quickly." I settled into the chair in front of the main monitoring station and immediately focused on the camera feed showing my father's bedroom window. The light was on, and I could see his silhouette moving slowly around the room. He was still alive, still fighting his cancer, still unaware that his daughters were playing a deadly game around his deathbed. "She'll probably wait until tomorrow to tell him," Jake said, studying the other camera angles. "Tonight she'll want to establish her alibi, maybe make some calls to set up the inheritance transfer process. People who plan murders usually can't resist getting started on the benefits immediately." As if summoned by his words, Vivian's BMW pulled into the driveway. She sat in the car for several minutes before getting out, probably composing herself for the performance she was about to give our dying father. When she finally walked to the front door, her posture was perfect. Head down, shoulders slumped, every inch the grieving sister who'd just lost her only sibling to suicide. "Here we go," I murmured, adjusting the audio equipment to pick up whatever conversation was about to take place. Watching my sister prepare to lie to our father about my death was going to be the hardest part of this entire operation, but it was also going to be the most revealing. How she chose to break the news would tell me everything I needed to know about her long-term plans and her true feelings about the family she was systematically destroying. The front door opened, and Vivian disappeared inside the house where she would spend the evening convincing our terminally ill father that his other daughter had committed suicide rather than watch him die. Through the audio feed, I could hear Vivian's heels clicking against the hardwood floors as she made her way through the house. She moved slowly, deliberately, as if the weight of terrible news was making each step difficult. The performance had already begun, even though Dad couldn't see her yet. I watched her pause outside his bedroom door for nearly 30 seconds, her hand raised to knock, but not quite making contact. She was preparing herself, getting into character for what might be the most important acting job of her life. When she finally knocked, it was soft and hesitant, the knock of someone who didn't want to disturb a sick man but had no choice. "Dad? It's Vivian. Can I come in?" His voice was weak but alert. "Of course, sweetheart. I was wondering where everyone went. The house has been too quiet today." She opened the door and stepped into view of our surveillance camera. Even from this distance, I could see that she'd been crying, or at least had made it look like she'd been crying. Her makeup was smudged just enough to suggest tears, and she carried herself with the fragile composure of someone barely holding together. "Dad, I need to talk to you about something," she said, settling into the chair beside his bed that I'd occupied every day for the past 6 months. "Something terrible has happened." "Is it Elena? I heard sirens earlier and she never came back upstairs." The fact that he'd noticed the sirens sent a chill through me. Dad was sicker than he'd been letting on, but his mind was still sharp enough to piece together that something was wrong. Vivian would have to be very careful about how she handled his questions. "Yes, Dad, it's about Elena." She took his hand, and I watched his face change as he processed her expression. "She's gone, Dad. She's dead." The silence that followed was devastating. I watched my father's face crumble as the words hit him, watched him age 10 years in the space of a heartbeat. His grip on Vivian's hand tightened, as if holding on to her could somehow make her words untrue. "How?" he whispered. "She took her own life," Vivian said, her voice breaking in exactly the right places. "The EMTs said it was an overdose, pills from her prescriptions." Dad's head fell back against his pillow, and I could see tears starting to flow down his cheeks. No, that's not possible. Elena wouldn't. She's stronger than that. She was in so much pain, Dad, more than any of us realized. Watching you suffer, feeling helpless to save you, dealing with her own demons from the war. It all became too much for her. I had to grip the arms of my chair to keep from standing up and screaming. The way she was framing my supposed suicide was masterful, positioning herself as the perceptive sister who understood my pain, while simultaneously making Dad feel responsible for my death. It was psychological manipulation at its finest. "I should have seen it," Dad said, his voice hollow. "I should have known she was struggling this much." "We all should have," Vivian replied, squeezing his hand. "But Elena was good at hiding her pain. She didn't want us to worry about her when you were dealing with so much." "Where is she now?" "The coroner's office. There will have to be an investigation, but it's just a formality. After that, we can lay her to rest." Dad closed his eyes, and for a moment I thought he might have lost consciousness. But then he spoke again, his voice barely audible through the surveillance equipment. "She came back from Afghanistan differently, quieter. I thought being here, taking care of me, might help her heal. Instead, I made everything worse." "Dad, don't say that. You didn't make anything worse. Elena chose to come home, chose to help with your care. That was her decision, and it came from love." The irony of Vivian comforting our father while planning to profit from both our deaths was almost unbearable. But I forced myself to keep watching, to keep listening, because every word she spoke was evidence I could use against her later. "What happens now?" Dad asked. "Now we take care of each other," Vivian said. "Elena would want us to focus on getting you better, on fighting this cancer with everything we have." She was good, very good. By positioning herself as the devoted daughter who would now shoulder the entire burden of Dad's care, she was setting up a narrative that would make her inheritance seem not just justified but earned. When Dad died, which his doctors said would happen within 2 months, she would be the grieving daughter who'd lost both her sister and her father within weeks of each other. "I need to make some phone calls," she continued. "Funeral arrangements, legal matters. Elena would want everything handled properly." "Yes, of course. Do whatever needs to be done." She kissed his forehead and stood to leave, but Dad caught her hand again. "Vivian? Thank you for being here. I don't know how I'd handle this alone." "You'll never be alone, Dad, I promise." As she left his room, I saw Dad break down completely, sobbing into his pillow with the kind of grief that comes from losing a child. The sound carried clearly through our audio equipment, and I had to mute the feed for several minutes because I couldn't bear to listen to his pain. Jake placed a hand on my shoulder. "You okay?" "No," I said honestly, watching him grieve for me while she manipulates him. "It's harder than I expected." "We can end this anytime you want. Just say the word and we'll expose everything." "Not yet. She's just getting started. I need to see how far she's willing to go." Vivian spent the next hour on the phone in Dad's study, making the calls she'd promised. But as I listened to her conversations, it became clear that funeral arrangements were not her priority. Her first call was to a probate attorney. "Mr. Davidson? This is Vivian Ramirez-Chen. We met last year when my father was updating his will." "Yes, that's right. I'm calling because there's been a family emergency. My sister Elena passed away this afternoon. Yes, it was sudden. Suicide. I'm wondering about the implications for Dad's estate planning." She listened for several minutes, occasionally asking clarifying questions about inheritance laws and the probate process. From her side of the conversation, I could tell that the attorney was explaining how my death would affect the distribution of Dad's assets. "So everything would revert to me as the sole surviving heir. I see. And if Dad were to pass away in the near future, the estate would be significantly simplified. Yes, I understand. We'll definitely want to schedule a meeting next week to review everything." Her second call was to someone she addressed as Marcus, the same voice I'd heard during her murder planning session. "It's done," she said simply. "Elena's dead. Dad thinks it was suicide, and the legal implications are exactly what we discussed. The attorney says we should be able to wrap up probate within 90 days once Dad passes." I couldn't hear Marcus's response, but Vivian's replies filled in most of the conversation. No complications at all. The EMTs bought the suicide story completely, and Dad's too grief-stricken to ask difficult questions. "Yes, I know it seems fast, but we can't risk him changing his will again." He was already talking about adjusting Elena's inheritance to reflect her caregiving contributions. "Tonight, I'll stay here with him, make sure he's comfortable, and we can discuss the timing for the next phase." The next phase. My stomach clenched as I realized she was talking about accelerating Dad's death. It wasn't enough for her to kill me. She was planning to murder our father too, probably making it look like the grief over my suicide had caused his condition to deteriorate rapidly. Her third call was to someone at Dad's oncology practice. "Dr. Martinez? This is Vivian Ramirez-Chen, Charles Ramirez's daughter." "Yes, I'm calling about Dad's care plan. We've had a family tragedy today. My sister Elena took her own life." "Thank you. Yes, it's been devastating. The thing is, Dad is taking this very hard, and I'm concerned about how the emotional stress might affect his condition." She was laying the groundwork, establishing a medical record that would support the narrative of a cancer patient whose will to live had been destroyed by grief. When Dad died in the coming days or weeks, his medical team would remember this conversation and attribute his decline to the natural progression of his disease combined with emotional trauma. I'm wondering if we should consider adjusting his pain management protocol. He's been in significant discomfort lately, and now with Elena gone. Yes, I think increased medication might be appropriate. He's suffering so much, both physically and emotionally. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Vivian carefully planting the idea that Dad might benefit from higher doses of pain medication that would, coincidentally, make it easier to administer a fatal overdose disguised as palliative care. When she finally hung up, she sat in Dad's study for a long time, staring at his desk where family photos showed happier times. In one picture, the three of us were posed together at my high school graduation, Vivian 14, and proud of her big sister. Dad, beaming with parental pride, all of us genuinely happy and connected. She picked up that photo and studied it for several minutes before setting it face down on the desk. The symbolism was clear. The family in that picture no longer existed. Elena was dead, Dad was dying, and soon Vivian would be the sole survivor with a $4 million inheritance, and no one left to challenge her version of events. But as I watched her sitting alone in that study, surrounded by the debris of the family she was systematically destroying, I realized something important. Vivian wasn't just planning to kill me and Dad for the money. She was erasing us because we represented something she couldn't tolerate: genuine love, sacrifice, and connection that made her own shallow existence look pathetic by comparison. She'd always been jealous of my relationship with Dad, resentful of the respect my military service had earned me, threatened by the way I'd stepped up to care for him during his illness. My death wasn't just about inheritance. It was about eliminating the sister who made her look selfish and superficial by comparison. As she finally stood and turned off the study light, preparing to spend the night playing the devoted daughter, I made a decision. I wasn't going to wait for her to kill Dad. I was going to accelerate my own timeline and expose her before she could complete her plan. Tomorrow, Vivian Ramirez-Chen was going to discover that some people are much harder to erase than she'd anticipated. The next morning arrived gray and cold, with a kind of Denver weather that made everything feel more ominous. I'd spent the night monitoring Vivian's movements through our surveillance system, watching her maintain her performance as the grieving sister even when she thought no one was looking. She'd checked on Dad every few hours, bringing him tea and sitting by his bedside with practiced concern, all while probably calculating how much longer she'd need to keep up the act. "Let's see." At 6:47 a.m., she made coffee in Dad's kitchen and carried a cup upstairs to his room. Through our audio feed, I could hear their conversation as she helped him with his morning medications. "How are you feeling today, Dad?" "Empty," he replied, his voice hoarse from crying. "I keep expecting to hear Elena's footsteps in the hallway or see her bringing breakfast up those stairs." "I know. The house feels different without her energy, doesn't it?" The way she said it made my skin crawl. Vivian had always been skilled at emotional manipulation, but hearing her comfort our father while actively planning his death reached a new level of psychological cruelty. "Dr. Martinez called back last night," she continued. "He wants to adjust your pain medication, maybe increase the dosage to help you through this difficult time." "I don't want to be sedated, Vivian. I want to feel this grief. Elena deserves that much from me." "But Dad, you're in physical pain too. Elena wouldn't want you to suffer unnecessarily." She was pushing the medication angle hard, exactly as I'd expected after overhearing her phone conversation the night before. But Dad was resisting, which complicated her timeline. If she couldn't convince him to accept higher doses voluntarily, she'd have to find another way to administer whatever she planned to use to kill him. At 8:15 a.m., Vivian's phone rang. She answered it in the kitchen, thinking she was out of range of our surveillance equipment. She was wrong. Marcus? Yes, I stayed the night. No, there's been a complication. Dad doesn't want increased pain medication, and his doctor is being cautious about dosage adjustments without proper medical justification. I know we discussed 3 days, but that might not be realistic if he won't cooperate with the medication changes. I couldn't hear Marcus's response, but Vivian's side of the conversation was revealing enough. Well, what about the insulin approach? His blood sugar has been unstable lately. Yes, I have access to his medical supplies. Elena kept everything organized in the bathroom cabinet. Tonight, I will work. After he falls asleep, I could administer enough to cause hypoglycemic shock. With his weakened condition, it would look like a natural complication of his cancer treatment. My hands clenched into fists as I listened to her calmly discuss murdering our father with insulin. She was planning to kill him tonight, less than 24 hours after my supposed suicide. The grief narrative she'd constructed would explain his rapid decline perfectly. A terminally ill man who'd lost the will to live after his daughter's death. No, there won't be an autopsy, she continued. He's under hospice care protocols, and insulin shock is a known risk for cancer patients. Dr. Martinez will sign the death certificate without question. Jake, who'd been monitoring a different audio feed, looked up from his equipment. She's accelerating the timeline. We need to move today. I know, but I want to catch her in the act, not just expose her plans. If we intervene too early, she'll claim it was all theoretical discussion, that she never intended to follow through. Elena, if we wait too long... My father dies tonight. I understand the risk. I turned back to the surveillance monitor, watching Vivian end her call and begin moving around the kitchen with renewed purpose. But if we're going to destroy her completely, we need irrefutable evidence, video of her actually attempting to kill him. At 10:30 a.m., Vivian left the house to run what she told Dad were funeral errands. In reality, she drove to a medical supply store in Aurora, the same one where I'd purchased my theatrical blood and special effects makeup. I watched through binoculars as she emerged 30 minutes later carrying a small bag that she immediately locked in her car's glove compartment. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Jake had positioned himself across the street with a telephoto lens, capturing photos of her transaction and the medical supply store's exterior. Whatever she bought, she paid cash and didn't want it visible, he reported through our communication system. While Vivian was out, I made a decision that Jake wouldn't approve of. I needed to see my father one more time before tonight's confrontation, needed to let him know that I was alive and that Vivian's grief performance was all an elaborate lie. I'm going in, I told Jake when he returned to the surveillance apartment. Absolutely not. If she comes back early, she won't. She's been gone for an hour and told Dad she'd be running errands all afternoon. I have time for a quick visit. Elena, this is insane. You'll blow the entire operation. My father is grieving for a daughter who isn't dead while his other daughter plans to murder him tonight. I'm not letting him spend what might be his last day believing that I abandoned him. Jake tried to argue, but I was already gathering the items I'd need for the visit. I'd prepared a small recording device that would capture Dad's reaction to learning I was alive, along with a detailed explanation of Vivian's murder plot that he could provide to police if something went wrong with our plan. At 1:45 p.m., I used my old key to enter through the back door of the house I'd grown up in. The familiar sounds and smells hit me immediately. The creak of the hardwood floors, the scent of Dad's aftershave mixed with the antiseptic smell of medical equipment, the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I climbed the stairs slowly, listening for any sound that might indicate Vivian had returned early. But the house was quiet except for the soft murmur of Dad's television and the occasional cough from his bedroom. I knocked on his door using the same rhythm I'd used since childhood. 2 quick raps followed by a pause, then 3 more. It was our private signal, something Vivian had never bothered to learn because she'd rarely spent time talking with Dad behind closed doors. Come in, he called, probably assuming it was Vivian returning from her errands. I opened the door and stepped into the room where I'd spent countless hours over the past 6 months, caring for him as his condition deteriorated. He was propped up in bed with several pillows, looking frailer than he had just 2 days ago. The grief of losing me had already begun to take its toll on his weakened body. When he saw me, his face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, confusion, and finally overwhelming relief. "Elena?" His voice was barely a whisper. But Vivian said, "The EMTs said..." "I'm alive, Dad. Very much alive." I moved to his bedside and took his hand, feeling the tremor in his fingers as he struggled to process what he was seeing. "I don't understand. If you're alive, then why did Vivian..." "Because she's planning to kill both of us for your inheritance. She pushed me into faking my death so I could gather evidence of her plans." I spent the next 20 minutes explaining everything: Vivian's phone conversation about my murder, the staged suicide, the surveillance operation Jake and I had set up. Dad listened with growing horror as I described how his younger daughter had systematically planned to eliminate his entire family for financial gain. "She's going to try to kill you tonight," I concluded, "probably with insulin, making it look like a complication from your cancer treatment." Dad's hand gripped mine tighter. "All this time, I thought she was grieving for you. The way she comforted me, stayed by my side." "She's a sociopath, Dad. She's been planning this for weeks, maybe months. Everything she's done since my supposed death has been calculated to position herself as the devoted surviving daughter." "What do we do?" "We let her try. Tonight, when she attempts to inject you with insulin, we'll have cameras recording everything. Jake will be monitoring from across the street, and police will be standing by to intervene before any real harm is done." "You want to use me as bait?" "I want to make sure she goes to prison for the rest of her life. If we confront her now, she'll claim it was all talk, that she never intended to follow through. But if we catch her actually attempting murder..." Dad was quiet for a long time, processing the magnitude of what his younger daughter had planned. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady despite the tears in his eyes. "She really would have killed us both. Without hesitation. The only thing that matters to Vivian is money, and we were standing between her and $4 million. Then we catch her, tonight. But Elena," he squeezed my hand, "promise me you won't take any unnecessary risks. I couldn't bear to lose you for real." "I promise, Dad. By tomorrow morning, this will all be over, and Vivian will be in custody." As I prepared to leave, Dad stopped me one more time. "Elena, I'm proud of you, for serving your country, for coming home to take care of me, and for being strong enough to fight back against this. Your sister may have forgotten what family means, but you never did." I kissed his forehead and left through the same back door I'd entered, carrying with me the knowledge that in just a few hours, I would either save my father's life or watch my sister destroy what remained of our family forever. At 7:30 p.m., Vivian returned to the house carrying takeout bags from Dad's favorite Thai restaurant. Through our surveillance feed, I watched her arrange the food on proper dishes, creating the appearance of a home-cooked meal designed to comfort a grieving father. Every detail was calculated. The way she warmed the plates, added fresh garnish, even lit a small candle to make the dinner feel special and intimate. She brought the tray upstairs to Dad's room, her performance of devoted caregiver, flawless as always. "I thought we should have a nice dinner together," she said, settling into the chair beside his bed. "Elena always said food was one of the best medicines for a broken heart." Dad played his part perfectly, accepting the meal while secretly knowing it might be his last if our plan failed. He ate slowly, asking Vivian about her day, and listening to her fabricated stories about funeral home visits and sympathy calls from concerned friends. She'd constructed an entire fictional narrative about the outpouring of support for our family during this difficult time. "Everyone remembers Elena so fondly," Vivian said, cutting his pad thai into smaller pieces. "Mrs. Patterson from next door brought flowers. The Johnsons left a casserole. Your old business partner called to offer his condolences." None of it was true. I'd been monitoring the house all day. And no neighbors had visited, no flowers had been delivered, no casseroles had appeared on the doorstep. But Dad nodded along, maintaining the fiction while internally preparing for the confrontation that would come later. After dinner, Vivian insisted on giving Dad his evening medications personally. She made a show of checking each bottle, reading labels carefully, and organizing the pills in the weekly dispenser that I'd been managing for months. But I noticed she palmed one bottle, his fast-acting insulin, and slipped it into her pocket when she thought he wasn't looking. "Dr. Martinez wants you to try this new sleep aid," she said, showing him a pill I didn't recognize. "It should help you rest better, especially with everything you're processing emotionally." Dad took the pill without question, though we'd agreed earlier that he'd only pretend to swallow it. The medication was probably intended to ensure he'd be unconscious when she administered the insulin injection, unable to call for help or fight back. At 9:15 p.m., she kissed his forehead and dimmed the bedroom lights. "Try to get some sleep, Dad. Tomorrow we'll start making arrangements for Elena's service." She left his room, but didn't go far. Through our thermal imaging equipment, Jake tracked her movements as she positioned herself in the hallway outside Dad's door, waiting for the sleep medication to take effect. She was being cautious, professional, following a timeline that would minimize her risk of discovery. At 9:45 p.m., she quietly opened his door and peered inside. Dad had been practicing his breathing exercises, slowing his respiration to mimic deep sleep. In the darkness of his room, with only the soft glow of his medical equipment providing light, the deception was convincing enough to fool someone who wanted to believe he was unconscious. Vivian entered the room slowly, carrying a small medical bag that contained the insulin and injection supplies she'd purchased that afternoon. She moved with the confidence of someone who'd rehearsed this moment in her mind repeatedly, each step calculated to minimize noise and maximize efficiency. She placed the bag on his nightstand and began preparing the injection with practiced movements. I realized she must have researched the proper dosage and administration technique. This wasn't an impulsive crime of passion, but a carefully planned medical murder designed to look like an accident. Through our audio feed, I could hear her whispering to Dad's supposedly unconscious form. "I'm sorry it has to be this way," she said softly. "But you were never going to get better, and Elena's death would have destroyed you slowly anyway. This is actually merciful." The rationalization was chilling in its clinical detachment. She genuinely believed she was doing him a favor by killing him quickly rather than allowing him to die naturally from cancer or grief. In her mind, she was being compassionate while also solving her financial problems. She filled the syringe with what appeared to be a massive dose of insulin, far more than his diabetes management required, easily enough to cause fatal hypoglycemic shock in someone with his compromised health. Her hands were steady as she prepared to inject the medication into his IV port, the most efficient delivery method that would ensure rapid absorption. "This won't hurt," she whispered, positioning the syringe against the injection site. "You'll just go to sleep and dream about Elena. Maybe you'll see her again, wherever people go after they die." Dad's eyes remained closed, his breathing steady, giving no indication that he was aware of what was happening. But I could see the slight tension in his shoulders, the barely perceptible tightening of his hands as he prepared for the moment when we'd agreed he should react. Vivian inserted the needle into the IV port and began slowly depressing the plunger. The insulin entered his bloodstream in a controlled flow designed to avoid immediate detection, while ensuring lethality within 30 to 40 minutes. She'd injected approximately half the syringe's contents when Dad suddenly opened his eyes and grabbed her wrist. "Hello, Vivian," he said calmly. "Having trouble sleeping?" The syringe dropped from her hand, clattering against the nightstand as her face went through a series of expressions: shock, fear, confusion, and finally desperate calculation, as she tried to process how her carefully orchestrated plan had gone wrong. "Dad, you're awake. I was just... Your medication," the doctor said. "The doctor said you were planning to murder me with insulin." He maintained his grip on her wrist while reaching for the emergency button that would alert Jake to intervene. "Just like you planned to murder Elena." "Murder?" "Dad, you're confused. The grief medication is making you paranoid. Elena committed suicide, remember? And I was only trying to help with your blood sugar management." "Elena is alive, Vivian. She's been watching you this entire time, recording your conversations, documenting your plans." For the first time since I'd known her, Vivian appeared genuinely stunned, Her composure cracked completely as the implications of Dad's words sank in. If Elena was alive, then everything she'd done over the past 24 hours had been observed and recorded. Her murder plot, her fake grief, her manipulation of medical professionals, all of it was evidence that could be used against her. "That's impossible," she whispered. "I saw her body. The EMTs confirmed she was dead." "You saw what she wanted you to see. My daughter is a combat veteran, Vivian. Did you really think you could outsmart someone trained in deception and survival?" The bedroom door opened and Jake entered with 2 uniformed police officers who'd been waiting in the surveillance apartment for our signal. Vivian's head snapped toward them, her eyes wide with the realization that she'd been caught in the act of attempted murder. "Vivian Ramirez-Chen," one of the officers said, "you're under arrest for attempted murder and conspiracy to commit murder." As they moved to restrain her, Vivian's shock transformed into rage. She lunged toward Dad, screaming, "You were supposed to die! Both of you were supposed to die! I did everything right!" The officers pulled her back before she could reach him, but her words were being recorded by multiple devices. Even without the insulin injection attempt, her confession was enough to guarantee a murder conviction. "I want my lawyer," she snarled as they cuffed her hands behind her back. "This is entrapment. They tricked me into this." "You tricked yourself," Dad said quietly, "the moment you decided money was more important than family." As they led her from the room, Vivian looked back one final time. "Where is she? Where's Elena? I want to see the sister who destroyed my life." That's when I stepped out of the shadows by his bedroom window, where I'd been positioned with a video camera to capture her confession and attempted murder. "Right here, Vivian," I said calmly, "very much alive and very much looking forward to testifying at your trial." The look on her face was worth every moment of risk we'd taken to expose her true nature. The ride to the police station took place in 2 separate vehicles, Vivian in the back of a patrol car, her hands cuffed behind her back, and her face a mask of cold fury, while I followed in Jake's sedan with copies of all our surveillance footage and audio recordings. Dad had been taken by ambulance to Denver Health as a precaution, though the small amount of insulin Vivian had managed to inject wasn't enough to cause serious harm. At the station, Detective Sarah Chen, no relation to Vivian despite the shared surname, took my statement in a sterile interview room that smelled of industrial coffee and fluorescent lighting. She was a compact woman in her 40s with intelligent eyes and the kind of patient demeanor that suggested she'd heard every possible variation of family dysfunction over her career. "Walk me through the surveillance setup," she said, reviewing the timeline Jake and I had prepared. "I need to understand how you documented her activities without interfering with the investigation." I explained our equipment placement, the audio monitoring capabilities, and the careful way we'd maintained our observation post while gathering evidence. Detective Chen took notes steadily, occasionally asking for clarification about technical details or legal considerations. The insulin injection attempt was recorded from multiple angles, 3 different cameras plus audio. We have her preparing the syringe, calculating the dosage, and her confession when Dad confronted her. And the planning conversations? The calls with this Marcus person? All documented. She discussed my murder, Dad's murder, the inheritance timeline, and her strategy for avoiding suspicion. We have dates, times, and complete transcripts. Detective Chen leaned back in her chair, studying the evidence summary. "This is one of the most thoroughly documented attempted murder cases I've seen. Your military background shows." I wanted to make sure there were no loopholes for her to exploit. Vivian's smart, manipulative, and has resources. If we were going to expose her, it had to be airtight. While I was giving my statement, Vivian was being processed in a holding cell 3 floors below. According to Detective Chen, she'd invoked her right to an attorney but continued making incriminating statements, despite multiple warnings to remain silent. "She keeps insisting that your fake death was an elaborate fraud designed to frame her," the detective said. "Her lawyer's going to have a difficult time explaining away the audio recordings of her planning your murder." At 11:47 p.m., I was finally allowed to leave the police station. Jake drove me to Denver Health, where Dad was being kept overnight for observation. The insulin injection had caused a minor blood sugar drop, but his medical team had stabilized his levels and declared him out of immediate danger. I found him awake in his hospital bed, looking older and more fragile than he had even that morning. The events of the evening had taken a visible toll on his already weakened constitution, but his eyes were alert and focused when I entered his room. "How did it go at the station?" he asked. "Vivian's been charged with 2 counts of attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and fraud. The district attorney thinks they have enough evidence to pursue first-degree murder charges, which carry a potential life sentence." Dad was quiet for a long moment, processing the reality that his younger daughter would likely spend the rest of her life in prison. "Part of me still can't believe she would have gone through with it. She injected you with insulin, Dad. If we hadn't intervened, you'd be dead right now." "I know. Intellectually, I know that. But 28 years of loving someone doesn't disappear overnight, even when they try to kill you." His struggle with conflicted emotions was understandable. Vivian wasn't some stranger who'd broken into our house. She was the little girl he'd taught to ride a bicycle, the teenager he'd driven to prom, the daughter whose college graduation photos still sat on his dresser. Accepting that she'd become a calculating killer required reshaping decades of parental love and protective instincts. "Dr. Martinez wants to keep you here for a few days," I said, changing the subject to something more manageable. "Make sure the insulin didn't cause any complications with your cancer treatment." "What about the house?" "Vivian had keys, access to my medical records, and knowledge of my routine. I don't feel safe going back there. Jake's installing a new security system tomorrow. Motion sensors, cameras, reinforced locks, and I'll be staying there full-time until this is resolved." "You don't have to do that, Elena. You've already sacrificed enough for this family." "It's not a sacrifice, Dad. It's where I want to be." The next morning brought a media storm that none of us had anticipated. Someone at the police station had leaked details about the case, and by 8 a.m., news vans were parked outside the hospital and our house. The story had everything journalists loved: family betrayal, inheritance murder plots, a veteran who'd faked her own death to catch a killer. My phone buzzed constantly with interview requests from local news stations, true crime podcasters, and national morning shows. The Denver Post ran a front-page story titled, "Sister's Deadly Inheritance Plot Foiled by Fake Death Scheme," complete with photos of Vivian being led away in handcuffs and surveillance footage from our operation. Jake handled most of the media inquiries, politely declining interviews, while I focused on Dad's medical care and legal preparations. The district attorney's office wanted me to review our evidence before Vivian's arraignment, scheduled for the following Monday. But the most unexpected call came from Marcus, the man whose voice I'd heard on Vivian's phone during her murder planning sessions. "Ms. Ramirez?" The voice was nervous, shaky. "My name is Marcus Hoffman. I think you know who I am. You're the man who helped my sister plan my murder." "Yes, I mean no. It's complicated." He paused, gathering courage. "I need to talk to you, in person. There are things about Vivian that you don't know, things that might be important for your case." "Why would you want to help me? You were part of her plan." "Because I never thought she'd actually go through with it. I thought we were just fantasizing. When I saw the news this morning, when I realized she'd actually tried to kill your father, I can't be part of this anymore." Detective Chen arranged the meeting at the police station, with Marcus's attorney present to negotiate potential immunity in exchange for his cooperation. What he revealed during our 3-hour conversation changed everything I thought I knew about my sister's motivations. Marcus had been Vivian's lover for over 2 years, but more importantly, he was a financial advisor who'd been helping her hide massive gambling debts from Dad and me. She owed nearly $300,000 to various creditors, including some who'd been making increasingly violent threats about repayment. The inheritance wasn't just about greed, Marcus explained. Vivian was desperate. She'd borrowed money against her expected inheritance, used your father's name as collateral for loans she couldn't repay. If she didn't get that money soon, she was looking at bankruptcy, legal action, maybe worse. How worse? Some of the people she owed money to weren't traditional lenders. There were threats against her safety, against your father's safety. She was convinced that killing both of you was the only way to protect herself and settle her debts. This revelation reframed everything. Vivian hadn't just been a greedy sociopath. She'd been a desperate woman who'd gotten in over her head with dangerous people and saw murder as her only escape route. It didn't excuse her actions, but it explained the urgency behind her timeline and the professional way she'd planned our deaths. "Will you testify?" Detective Chen asked Marcus. "Yes, but I want protection. If Vivian's creditors find out I'm cooperating with the police, they'll assume I know where their money is." As we left the police station that afternoon, I realized that Vivian's arrest was just the beginning of a much larger investigation into her financial dealings and the people who'd been pressuring her to repay her debts. Our family drama had intersected with organized crime in ways that would take months to fully unravel. But for now, Dad was safe, Vivian was in custody, and I was officially alive again. Whatever complications lay ahead, we'd face them together as the family we'd always been, minus the member who'd tried to destroy us all for money she'd already spent. The arraignment took place the following Monday in a packed courtroom that felt more like a media circus than a legal proceeding. Vivian appeared in an orange jumpsuit, her hair pulled back severely and her face showing none of the polished composure she'd maintained during her murder plot. The woman who'd spent years perfecting her image as a successful social media entrepreneur now looked exactly what she was, a desperate criminal caught in the act. Judge Patricia Morales presided over the hearing with the no-nonsense efficiency of someone who'd seen too many family murder cases over her 20-year career. She read the charges in a clear, steady voice that carried to every corner of the courtroom. 2 counts of attempted murder in the first degree, conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and reckless endangerment. Vivian's attorney, David Brennan, was a well-known criminal defense lawyer whose reputation for getting wealthy clients reduced sentences had apparently appealed to her sense of entitlement. He entered a plea of not guilty on all charges, then immediately requested bail consideration based on his client's lack of prior criminal history and ties to the community. "Your Honor," he argued, "my client is a successful businesswoman with deep roots in Denver. She's never been arrested, never shown any signs of violent behavior, and poses no flight risk to the court." District Attorney Monica Valdez stood to respond, her expression grim as she addressed the judge. "Your Honor, the defendant attempted to murder 2 family members for financial gain, including injecting her terminally ill father with a potentially lethal dose of insulin. She demonstrates a complete disregard for human life and has already proven her willingness to commit premeditated murder. The state strongly opposes any consideration of bail." Judge Morales reviewed the evidence summary that had been prepared over the weekend, including transcripts of our surveillance recordings and photos from the insulin injection attempt. The silence in the courtroom stretched as she considered the arguments. "Given the severity of the charges and the premeditated nature of the alleged crimes," she finally said, "bail is denied. The defendant will remain in custody pending trial." Vivian's composure finally cracked as the judge's words sank in. She turned toward the gallery where I was sitting with Dad, her eyes blazing with the kind of rage that comes from someone who's always believed the rules didn't apply to her. "This is insane!" she shouted, causing the bailiff to move toward her. "I'm the victim here! They conspired against me, entrapped me, manipulated me into a situation where I had no choice." Judge Morales banged her gavel sharply. "Ms. Ramirez-Chen, you will remain silent or be held in contempt. Mr. Brennan, control your client." As they led Vivian away, she continued protesting her innocence and demanding that someone investigate what she called our elaborate fraud scheme. Her voice echoed through the courthouse corridors until the security doors cut off her complaints. Outside the courthouse, we were immediately surrounded by reporters shouting questions about the case, our family dynamics, and how it felt to watch my sister be denied bail. Dad, still weak from his hospitalization, leaned heavily on my arm as we pushed through the crowd toward Jake's car. "Elena, how does it feel to know your sister tried to kill you? Mr. Ramirez, do you plan to forgive your daughter? Was this about money or something deeper?" I helped Dad into the passenger seat without responding to any of the questions. The media attention was overwhelming, but I'd learned in the military that sometimes the best response to chaos was simple, disciplined silence. That afternoon, Detective Chin called with updates about the broader investigation into Vivian's financial situation. The gambling debts Marcus had revealed were even more extensive than initially reported, and several of her creditors had criminal records for loan sharking and debt collection violence. "We've identified at least 6 different sources of illegal loans," she explained during our meeting at the police station. "Your sister borrowed money from some very dangerous people, using your father's name and social security number for several of the loans." "Identity theft on top of attempted murder," I said. "How deep does this go?" "We're still uncovering the full scope, but it appears she's been engaged in systematic fraud for over 18 months. Credit cards opened in your father's name, forged signatures on loan documents, even a second mortgage on his house that he knew nothing about." The revelation that Vivian had been stealing Dad's identity while living in his house and accepting his support added another layer of betrayal to an already devastating situation. She hadn't just planned to kill us, she'd been systematically robbing him for months while playing the role of caring daughter. "The good news," Detective Chen continued, "is that this additional evidence strengthens our case significantly. The financial crimes establish a clear motive and pattern of deception that supports the murder charges." "What about protective custody? If these loan sharks think Dad has access to Vivian's assets, we're working with federal authorities on that. The Organized Crime Unit is already investigating several of the people your sister borrowed from. Your father may need to consider temporary relocation until this is resolved." That evening, I sat with Dad in his hospital room, helping him process the full scope of what Vivian had done to our family. The financial crimes were almost as devastating as the attempted murders. His credit was destroyed, his house was encumbered with illegal liens, and his medical care was now threatened by debts he'd never authorized. "I keep trying to understand when she changed," he said, staring out the window at the Denver skyline. "When did the little girl who used to bring me drawings become someone who could plan my murder? Maybe she didn't change, Dad. Maybe we just never saw who she really was." "You saw it, though. Even as children, you were always protective of her, always making excuses for her behavior. I wonder if some part of you knew she was capable of this." I thought about his observation, remembering incidents from our childhood that had seemed like normal sibling rivalry at the time but now appeared more sinister in retrospect. Vivian's casual cruelty to animals, her ability to lie convincingly about serious matters, the way she'd manipulated adults by playing innocent while engineering conflicts between other children. "I knew she was selfish," I admitted. "I knew she had no empathy for other people's pain, but I thought that was just immaturity, something she'd grow out of. Instead, she grew into it." The next morning brought news that would complicate our lives even further. Marcus Hoffman had been found dead in his apartment, apparently from a drug overdose, though Detective Chen suspected it was actually murder, designed to eliminate a key witness in Vivian's case. "His apartment had been searched," she explained during our emergency meeting. "Professional job, very thorough. They were looking for something specific, probably financial records or evidence that could implicate Vivian's creditors." "Does this change the case against her?" "Not significantly. We have his recorded testimony and corroborating evidence from bank records. But it does confirm that we're dealing with people who are willing to kill to protect their interests. Which means Dad and I are still targets." "Exactly. I'm recommending you both enter protective custody until we can arrest the major players in this loan sharking operation." The irony wasn't lost on me. Vivian's attempt to escape her dangerous creditors by murdering us had instead exposed their criminal organization to law enforcement scrutiny. Her desperation to solve her problems had made everything worse for everyone involved, including herself. As we prepared to leave Denver for a safe house in an undisclosed location, I reflected on how completely our family had been destroyed by greed and debt. In less than a week, we'd gone from a normal family dealing with terminal illness to fugitives hiding from organized crime figures who wanted to collect on loans Vivian had taken in Dad's name. But we were alive, we were together, and Vivian was in custody where she couldn't hurt anyone else. Whatever challenges lay ahead, we'd face them with the knowledge that we'd survived her attempt to erase us from existence. Some victories come at a higher cost than others, but they're still victories. The safe house was a modest ranch home in Pueblo, Colorado, about 2 hours south of Denver, and far enough from our normal lives to provide the anonymity that federal marshals insisted we needed. The house sat on a quiet residential street where neighbors minded their own business, and the only excitement was the weekly arrival of the ice cream truck that played its tinny melody through the subdivision. Dad adapted to the protective custody better than I'd expected. His medical equipment had been transferred by a team of marshals who specialized in relocating witnesses with complex health needs, and his treatment schedule continued without interruption. Dr. Martinez made house calls twice a week, traveling with a security escort that probably cost more than most people's annual salary. "At least the food is better here," Dad said during our third week in hiding, gesturing to the meal I'd prepared from groceries that were delivered by armed federal agents. "Your sister never learned to cook anything that didn't come from a restaurant." It was the first time he'd mentioned Vivian without the weight of immediate grief, and I took it as a sign that he was beginning to process what she'd done to us with something approaching acceptance rather than devastation. The trial preparations continued even while we were in protective custody. District Attorney Valdez visited us twice, bringing updates about plea negotiations that Vivian's lawyer had initiated and rejected when the prosecution refused to consider anything less than life imprisonment without parole. "She's maintaining her innocence," Valdez explained during her second visit. "Claims the insulin injection was intended to help your father's blood sugar regulation, and that our surveillance constitutes entrapment." "What about the recorded conversations where she planned my murder?" Her attorney argues those were fantasy discussions, not serious criminal planning. He's trying to frame the entire case as a family dispute that got out of hand rather than premeditated attempted murder. I'd expected this defense strategy. Vivian had always been skilled at rewriting reality to suit her needs, and now she was applying that talent to criminal defense. But the evidence against her was overwhelming. Hours of recorded conversations, video footage of the insulin injection, financial records proving her motive, and testimony from multiple witnesses. During our fourth week in protective custody, Detective Chen called with news about the loan sharking investigation. Federal agents had arrested 12 people in coordinated raids across Denver and Colorado Springs, including several who'd been directly involved in threatening Vivian about her debt repayment. "We found records showing that your sister owed money to at least 15 different criminal organizations," Chen explained. "The total debt was over $400,000, not $300 like Marcus originally told us." "How did she even access that much illegal credit?" "She was good at it. Professional references, forged financial statements, your father's identity as collateral. She'd built an entire fictional financial profile that made her look like a low-risk borrower." The investigation had also revealed that Vivian's social media business was largely fictitious. While she maintained the appearance of a successful entrepreneur with major corporate clients, most of her income actually came from small-scale fraud schemes, fake influencer campaigns, embezzled client funds, and identity theft operations that targeted elderly social media users. "Everything about her life was a lie," I told Dad after hanging up the phone. Her business, her financial situation, even her relationship with Marcus was probably just part of her criminal network. "I keep thinking about all the times she visited over the past year," Dad said. "Every conversation, every gesture of affection, every moment of apparent concern for my health. All of it was just her calculating when and how to kill me." The psychological impact of that realization was profound. Vivian hadn't just attempted murder. She'd spent months psychologically torturing our father by pretending to love him while actively planning his death. The emotional cruelty was almost worse than the physical violence she'd attempted. In our 6th week of protective custody, we received word that Vivian had fired David Brennan and hired a new attorney, Maria Santos, a public defender known for taking high-profile cases that other lawyers considered unwinnable. Santos immediately requested a competency evaluation, claiming that her client was suffering from a psychological break that prevented her from assisting in her own defense. "It's a desperate strategy," District Attorney Valdez explained during our weekly briefing call. "If she can convince a judge that she's mentally incompetent, she might avoid trial and get committed to a psychiatric facility instead of prison." Would that mean a shorter sentence? Potentially. Psychiatric commitments are reviewed regularly, and patients can be released if they're deemed no longer dangerous. Prison sentences are fixed. The competency evaluation took 3 weeks and involved multiple psychiatric examinations by court-appointed specialists. During this time, we remained in protective custody, while federal agents continued dismantling the criminal organizations that had been pressuring Vivian to repay her debts. The psychological evaluation results were released on a Thursday morning in late spring. Dr. Rebecca Morrison, the court-appointed psychiatrist, had concluded that Vivian was completely competent to stand trial and showed no signs of mental illness that would impair her ability to assist in her defense. The defendant demonstrates clear understanding of the charges against her and the potential consequences, Dr. Morrison's report stated. Her attempts to manipulate the evaluation process and fabricate symptoms of mental illness actually demonstrate sophisticated cognitive functioning and awareness of legal strategies. Vivian had tried to fake mental illness just as I had faked my death, but unlike my deception, hers was transparent to professionals trained to recognize such attempts. Her intelligence and manipulative skills, which had served her criminal enterprises so well, now worked against her by making it obvious that she was psychologically capable of standing trial. Maria Santos requested a change of venue, arguing that media coverage had made it impossible for her client to receive a fair trial in Denver. Judge Morales denied the motion, noting that the case had received national attention and that moving the trial to another Colorado jurisdiction wouldn't significantly reduce pretrial publicity. The trial date was set for early fall, giving both sides time to prepare their cases and allowing the federal investigation into the loan sharking operation to conclude. We would remain in protective custody until after the trial, but the marshals indicated that we'd be able to return to Denver once Vivian was convicted, and the organized crime figures who'd threatened our family were sentenced. Dad's health had actually improved during our time in protective custody. The stress of Vivian's constant manipulation and the fear of her murder plot had been taking a greater toll on his condition than any of us had realized. With that psychological burden removed, his appetite returned, his sleep improved, and his oncologist reported that his cancer markers had stabilized. It's remarkable what eliminating chronic stress can do for cancer patients, Dr. Martinez observed during one of his house calls. Your father's body is responding better to treatment now than it has in months. On our final Sunday in protective custody, Dad and I sat on the safe house's back porch, watching the sunset paint the Colorado mountains in shades of gold and purple. It was peaceful in a way that our lives hadn't been for over a year, and I found myself reluctant to return to the complexity and danger of the real world. "Are you ready for this trial?" Dad asked. "I'm ready to watch her face the consequences of what she did to us," I replied. "And I'm ready to rebuild our lives without her shadow hanging over everything. She was my daughter too, Elena. Part of me will always grieve for the person I thought she was." "I know, Dad, but that person never existed. The Vivian we loved was just another one of her lies." As we prepared to leave protective custody and return to Denver for the trial, I realized that our family's story was entering its final chapter. Soon Vivian would face justice for her crimes, and Dad and I could begin the process of healing from the damage she'd inflicted on our lives. Whatever verdict the jury reached, we had already won the most important victory. We had survived her attempt to erase us, and we had done it together. The trial began on a crisp October morning, with jury selection that took 3 days longer than expected. Maria Santos challenged potential jurors aggressively, dismissing anyone who admitted to following the case in the media or expressed strong opinions about family violence. She was building a defense strategy that would require a jury sympathetic to the idea that Vivian had been driven to desperation by circumstances beyond her control. District Attorney Valdez approached jury selection differently, looking for people who could handle complex financial evidence and wouldn't be swayed by emotional manipulation. She needed jurors who could separate Vivian's sob story from the cold facts of attempted murder. I watched from the gallery as my sister sat at the defense table in a conservative navy suit that made her look younger and more vulnerable than she had in years. Santos had obviously coached her on courtroom demeanor. Vivian kept her eyes downcast, occasionally dabbing at them with tissues, projecting the image of a broken woman rather than a calculating killer. The opening statements began on Thursday morning. Valdez spoke first, laying out the prosecution's case with methodical precision that reminded me of military briefings I'd attended in Afghanistan. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about greed, disguised as grief, she began. The defendant, Vivian Ramirez Chen, systematically planned the murders of her father and sister to inherit $4 million and escape gambling debts to dangerous criminals. She researched methods, established alibis, and came within minutes of successfully executing both murders. Valdez walked the jury through our surveillance recordings, playing key excerpts where Vivian discussed her murder plans with Marcus and later attempted to justify the insulin injection to our unconscious father. The evidence was damning, each piece building on the previous one to create an overwhelming case for premeditated attempted murder. The defendant will claim she was desperate, that she had no choice, that she was protecting her family from violent creditors, Valdez continued. But nothing, no debt, no threat, no circumstance, justifies planning the cold-blooded murder of your own father and sister. Maria Santos took a completely different approach in her opening statement, immediately acknowledging that Vivian had made terrible choices, while arguing that those choices stemmed from psychological trauma and external pressure rather than criminal intent. Vivian Ramirez Chen is not a monster, Santos told the jury. She is a woman who became trapped in a nightmare of debt and violence, who watched her father dying slowly while her sister struggled with combat trauma. When dangerous criminals began threatening her family's safety, she made desperate decisions that she deeply regrets. Santos painted a picture of Vivian as a victim of predatory lenders who had exploited her legitimate business ventures and turned them into criminal enterprises. According to this narrative, the murder planning was fantasy, a way for Vivian to cope with overwhelming stress rather than serious criminal intent. You will hear evidence that my client never intended to harm anyone, Santos continued. The insulin injection was a medical intervention gone wrong, not an attempted murder. The recorded conversations were stress-induced fantasies, not criminal conspiracies. The prosecution's case took 5 days to present, with Valdez calling witnesses in a carefully planned sequence designed to build irrefutable evidence of premeditation and intent. Detective Chen testified about the surveillance operation and the evidence we'd gathered. Dr. Martinez explained how the insulin dosage Vivian had prepared would have been fatal to a cancer patient. Jake detailed our fake death operation and the technical aspects of our recording equipment. When I took the stand as the prosecution's final witness, the courtroom was packed with reporters, true crime enthusiasts, and curious members of the public who'd been following the case. Vivian stared at me with undisguised hatred as I was sworn in, probably still unable to believe that her supposedly dead sister was testifying about her crimes. Valdez led me through my testimony methodically, starting with my military background and moving through the events that had led to our fake death operation. I described overhearing Vivian's murder planning conversation, the decision to stage my suicide, and the surveillance operation that had captured her attempting to kill our father. When you heard your sister planning your murder, what was your emotional reaction? Valdez asked. Shock initially, I replied, then anger. But mostly determination to protect my father and gather evidence that would prevent her from succeeding. Did you ever consider confronting her directly about what you'd overheard? No, Vivian is skilled at manipulation and deception. If I'd confronted her, she would have claimed it was all a misunderstanding while finding another way to kill us. Santos's cross-examination was aggressive, focusing on what she characterized as our elaborate deception and entrapment of her client. She tried to portray me as a vindictive sister who had manipulated circumstances to frame Vivian for crimes she never intended to commit. Isn't it true that you've harbored resentment toward my client for years? Santos asked. No, I loved my sister, which is why her betrayal was so devastating. But you admit to staging an elaborate fake death scheme designed to manipulate her behavior? I admit to protecting myself and my father from someone who was planning to murder us for money. You recorded private conversations without consent, manipulated evidence, and created circumstances designed to incriminate my client. Isn't that entrapment? Recording someone planning murder isn't entrapment, it's evidence gathering, and we didn't manipulate Vivian into attempting murder. We simply documented what she was already planning to do. The defense case lasted only 2 days. Santos called character witnesses who testified to Vivian's previous kindness and community involvement, though none of them could speak to her recent behavior or financial situation. She also presented evidence about the threats Vivian had received from loan sharks, arguing that fear for her family's safety had driven her to consider desperate measures. Vivian herself never took the stand. Santos explained to the jury that her client was too emotionally fragile to testify, but I suspected the real reason was that Vivian couldn't be trusted not to incriminate herself further under cross-examination. The closing arguments took place on a Friday afternoon. Valdez summarized the evidence efficiently, reminding the jury that good people sometimes face difficult circumstances without resorting to murder. Debt is not a defense for attempted murder, she concluded. Fear is not justification for planning to kill your own family. The defendant made choices, calculated, premeditated choices, that brought us to this courtroom today. Santos made one final appeal to the jury's sympathy, arguing that Vivian's actions were the result of psychological breakdown rather than criminal intent. This is a tragedy, not a crime, she said, a woman broken by circumstances beyond her control, facing impossible choices with no good options. The jury deliberated for 6 hours across 2 days. When they returned to the courtroom Monday morning, their faces were solemn as Judge Morales asked for their verdict. On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree of Charles Ramirez, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree of Elena Ramirez, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of fraud, we find the defendant guilty. Vivian's composure finally cracked completely as the guilty verdicts were read. She screamed at the jury, calling them idiots and claiming they'd been manipulated by our lies. Santos and the bailiffs had to physically restrain her as she lunged toward the jury box, shrieking threats and accusations. "This isn't over," she yelled as they dragged her from the courtroom. "You think you've won, but this isn't over." Judge Morales scheduled sentencing for the following week, when Vivian would learn that her attempt to inherit $4 million had instead earned her life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentencing hearing took place the following Monday in the same courtroom where Vivian had been convicted just 5 days earlier. The gallery was packed again, but this time the atmosphere felt different, more final, more weighted with the gravity of what was about to happen. Dad sat beside me in the front row, his hand occasionally reaching for mine when the proceedings became particularly intense. Judge Morales had reviewed the pre-sentencing reports over the weekend, including victim impact statements that Dad and I had submitted detailing how Vivian's crimes had affected our lives. The psychological evaluation had been updated to reflect her courtroom outburst, with Dr. Morrison noting that Vivian's violent reaction to the verdict demonstrated, quote, a continued lack of remorse and potential for future dangerous behavior. Vivian appeared in shackles and an orange jumpsuit, her hair unkempt, and her eyes showing the kind of hollow rage that comes from someone who's finally been held accountable for their actions. She'd fired Maria Santos immediately after the verdict and was now representing herself, which Judge Morales had reluctantly allowed despite strong recommendations against it. "Your Honor," Vivian said when given the opportunity to address the court, "I want to state for the record that this entire proceeding has been a travesty of justice. I am the victim of an elaborate conspiracy between my sister and law enforcement to frame me for crimes I never committed." Her voice carried the same manipulative tone she'd always used when trying to rewrite reality to suit her needs, but now it sounded desperate and unhinged rather than persuasive. "Elena Ramirez faked her own death to entrap me, violated my privacy with illegal surveillance, and manipulated circumstances to make my actions appear criminal. I was trying to help my father with his medical needs, not harm him." Judge Morales listened with the patience of someone who'd heard similar denials from countless defendants over her career. When Vivian finished her statement, the judge's response was measured but firm. "Ms. Ramirez-Chen, the jury has spoken clearly about your guilt, and the evidence presented at trial was overwhelming. Your continued denial of responsibility is noted and will be considered in my sentencing decision." District Attorney Valdez then presented the prosecution's sentencing recommendation, asking for the maximum penalty under Colorado law, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for each attempted murder count, to run consecutively rather than concurrently. The defendant's crimes represent the ultimate betrayal of family trust, Valdez argued. She planned and attempted to execute the murders of her own father and sister for financial gain, showing a level of premeditation and callousness that demands the harshest possible sentence. When it came time for victim impact statements, Dad spoke first. He approached the podium slowly, still weak from his cancer treatment, but determined to address the daughter who had tried to kill him. "Vivian," he said, looking directly at her despite her attempts to avoid eye contact, "you were my daughter for 28 years. I loved you, supported you, and trusted you with my life. When I needed care during my illness, you moved into my house and accepted my gratitude while secretly planning my murder." His voice remained steady despite the tears in his eyes. "The betrayal is almost worse than the attempted murder itself. You made me doubt my own perceptions, made me feel guilty for surviving when you wanted me dead. That psychological torture will stay with me for whatever time I have left. But I want you to know that I forgive you," he continued, causing Vivian to look up sharply. "Not because you deserve forgiveness, but because carrying hatred for my own daughter would poison what remains of my life. I forgive you, and I pity you for becoming someone capable of such evil." When my turn came to address the court, I had prepared remarks but found myself speaking more personally than I'd planned. "Your Honor, my sister didn't just try to kill me, she tried to erase me. She planned to make my death look like suicide, to have my final act on Earth be a lie that would cause our father additional pain. She wanted to steal not just my life, but my reputation and my father's peace of mind." I looked at Vivian, who was staring at the defense table rather than meeting my eyes. For months, I watched her manipulate our dying father, pretending to care for him while researching how to kill him. She sat by his bedside and comforted him about my supposed death while planning his murder for that same night. That level of psychological cruelty goes beyond greed. It's pure evil. "But Vivian didn't win," I continued. "Dad and I survived because we fought back, because we refused to be victims of her manipulation. She's sitting in chains while we're rebuilding our lives, and that's the justice our family deserves." Judge Morales took a brief recess before announcing her sentencing decision. When court reconvened 20 minutes later, her expression was grave as she addressed Vivian directly. "Ms. Ramirez-Chen, you have been convicted of attempting to murder your own father and sister in a calculated scheme to inherit their estate. The evidence shows extensive premeditation, sophisticated planning, and a complete disregard for human life. Your crimes represent a fundamental betrayal of the most basic human bonds, the trust between family members, the sacred duty to care for aging parents, the love that should exist between siblings. You violated every one of these bonds in pursuit of money." Judge Morales paused, reviewing her notes before continuing. "The court finds no mitigating circumstances that would justify leniency. Your continued denial of responsibility and lack of remorse demonstrate that you remain a danger to society. On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree of Charles Ramirez, I sentence you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree of Elena Ramirez, I sentence you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, to run consecutively with the previous sentence. On the charges of conspiracy and fraud, I sentence you to 25 years imprisonment, to run concurrently with the murder sentences." Vivian's reaction was immediate and violent. She lunged across the defense table, screaming at Judge Morales, and demanding that someone investigate what she called this criminal conspiracy against her. The bailiffs moved quickly to restrain her, but not before she managed to knock over her chair and scatter legal documents across the floor. "You're all going to pay for this," she shrieked as they dragged her toward the courtroom exit. "Elena, you think you've won, but I'll find a way to make you pay. This isn't over." Her threats echoed through the courthouse corridors until the security doors cut them off, leaving behind a silence that felt like the end of a long, terrible storm. Outside the courthouse, Dad and I faced the media one final time. The questions were similar to those we'd heard after Vivian's arrest, but now they carried a sense of closure rather than ongoing crisis. "How does it feel to know your sister will spend the rest of her life in prison?" "It feels like justice," I replied simply. "My father and I can finally move forward without fear." "Do you think she'll appeal the conviction?" "She can try, but the evidence against her was overwhelming." The jury saw through her lies, and so will any appeals court. That evening, Dad and I returned to his house in Cherry Hills Village for the first time since Vivian's arrest 6 months earlier. Jake had supervised extensive security upgrades, and federal agents had cleared the property of any surveillance equipment or safety threats. Walking through rooms where Vivian had planned our murders felt surreal, but not frightening. She was locked away forever, her criminal associates were in federal prison, and her debts had been resolved through asset forfeiture proceedings that would prevent any future harassment of our family. "It's over," Dad said as we sat in his study, looking at family photos that no longer included images of his younger daughter. "She can't hurt us anymore." "It's over," I agreed, and we survived. 3 months later, I received a letter from the Colorado Women's Correctional Facility. Vivian had written to inform me that she was appealing her conviction and that she expected to be vindicated by higher courts. The letter was filled with the same delusional thinking and refusal to accept responsibility that had characterized her defense. I read it once, then threw it away without responding. Vivian was exactly where she belonged, and nothing she could say would change that reality. Dad's cancer went into remission that spring, a development his doctors attributed partly to the reduced stress in his life. We started traveling together, visiting places we'd always talked about seeing but had never found time for. On the first anniversary of Vivian's sentencing, we didn't mark the date with any special ceremony. Instead, we had dinner at home and talked about plans for Dad's upcoming birthday celebration. The woman who had tried to erase us from existence had instead erased herself from our lives forever, and we had never been happier. 5 years later, I was unpacking boxes in my new house when I found it, a letter that had been forwarded through 3 different addresses, postmarked from the Colorado Women's Correctional Facility. Vivian's handwriting, shakier now but still recognizable. "Elena," it read, "I've had 5 years to think about what I did. The other inmates here call me a family killer, and they're right. I destroyed everything good in my life for money I never even got to spend. I know you'll probably throw this away, but I need you to know that I'm sorry. Really sorry. Not because I got caught, but because I became someone capable of trying to kill the 2 people who loved me most." The letter went on for 3 pages, detailing her regret and asking for forgiveness she knew she didn't deserve. At the bottom she'd written, "Dad's birthday is next week. I remember. I always will." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my desk drawer. I didn't respond, but I didn't throw it away either. That weekend, Dad and I celebrated his 72nd birthday with cake, terrible karaoke, and stories about his latest volunteer work at the Veterans Hospital. His cancer remained in remission, and he looked healthier than he had in years. "Any regrets?" he asked as we cleaned up after the party. "None," I said. "You?" "Just one. I wish she could have been here to see how happy we are." Sometimes the people who try to destroy you end up giving you exactly what you needed, the strength to build something better from the ashes of their betrayal. If this story resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. Have you ever had to cut toxic family members out of your life? Share your experiences in the comments below. I read every single one. Until next time, remember, you're stronger than the people who try to break you.